Hola, buenos días. Sí. Empezamos. Vale, se me oye bien, perfecto. Muchas gracias a todas las personas presentes en la sala y presentes en casa o en despachos online. Y quería presentar, y es un placer presentar a Belinda Gallardo, nuestra ponente del seminario de hoy. Voy a hacer una breve introducción a su currículum para que sepáis en lo que está trabajando, que luego veréis en su presentación. Y desde que se licenció en la Universidad de Salamanca en el 2004 y se doctoró en la Universidad de Girona en el 2009, no ha dejado de trabajar en ciencia. A partir de su doctorado en el 2010 y hasta el 2021, ha ido encadenando trabajos de postdoc en diferentes centros. Comenzó en la Universidad de Cambridge con un contrato Marie Curie en el 2010. En el 2013 se incorporó en la Estación Biológica de Doñana con un contrato Severo Ochoa, ¿no? Y desde el 2014 hasta el presente tiene una relación íntima con el Instituto Pirenaico de Ecología, donde es ahora investigadora del CSIC. Sacó su plaza en el 22 y desde entonces trabaja allí con especies invasoras y cambio climático. Pues es una científica multidisciplinar en la que utiliza diferentes técnicas ecológicas y modelos estadísticos para proveer de datos sobre distribuciones o de especies invasoras, por ejemplo, que nos va a contar un poco en la charla de hoy. Decir que actualmente es investigadora y coordinadora del Grupo de Investigación de Restauración Ecológica en el Instituto Pirenaico de Ecología y que su charla de hoy, como veis ahí en el título, va a tratar sobre los riesgos que plantean las especies exóticas invasoras para la prestación de servicios ecosistémicos. Entonces, tienes los siguientes minutos para hablar y nada, pues el estrado es tuyo.
Muchas gracias, Anabel.
Nada.
Es un placer que me presentes tú, además, que te tengo mucha admiración. Nos conocimos sobre todo dentro del proyecto Live Invasive y que es la primera vez que vine aquí al museo. Yo llevo en el CSIC desde hace más de 20 años y, sin embargo, esta es la segunda vez que estoy aquí. Es mi excusa para poder volver a visitar esto porque me fascina el sitio que tenéis aquí. Así que nada, me has descrito muy bien toda la trayectoria, todo el vericueto que he tenido. Hice la tesis en el Instituto Pirenaico y ahora pues he vuelto al Instituto Pirenaico, entonces no de continuo, pero on and off, pues todo el tiempo he estado vinculada al CSIC de un modo o de otro. Bueno, estoy empezando en español, pero luego ya empiezo con inglés, no os preocupéis. Me lo he preparado en inglés. Comencé a trabajar con especies invasoras en el 2009 al acabar mi tesis porque es cuando apareció el mejillón cebra en el Ebro, que es una de las especies invasoras así como más famosas y que más preocupan, y entonces empecé el postdoc con el mejillón cebra y a partir de ahí fui pues como expandiendo a otras especies acuáticas al principio y después a todo tipo de especies invasoras porque sobre todo trabajo con herramientas estadísticas, modelos de regresión, metaanálisis, modelos de distribución, que más o menos te puedes apañar con distintos tipos de especies, aunque serías absolutamente incapaz y torpe a la hora de estudiarlas en campo, ¿no? Pero en un ordenador pues es más fácil. Entonces, para la charla de hoy he traído pues 3 de los trabajos científicos así un poco más relevantes que he ido publicando a lo largo de todo este tiempo sobre especies invasoras. Todos son sobre estadística, modelización, etcétera, así que me temo que hoy campo no hay. Pero bueno, so the talk is going to be about the risk posed by invasive species to biodiversity and ecosystem services. And the main thread of my research, the main point of my research is that the impact of invasive species depends not only on where the invasive species is present, not only about the exposure of native species or ecosystems to invasive species, but also depends on vulnerability, on how vulnerable ecosystems are. So I'd like to guide you a little bit along this thread about this rationale so that you understand a little bit the rest of the studies that will come after. So biodiversity and ecosystem services have been declining over the last 50 years. This was the main message from the IPE-CSIC Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. We already knew about that. We just had all the evidence collected together and some figures to illustrate it. The only services that seem to be increasing are those that are tightly linked with human activities because they are co-produced with humans, such as the production of food, materials, or energy. But the rest, they are all declining. We also know that invasive species is one of 5 major causes behind this decline. Overall, in islands, invasive species have been related with the extinction of many, many species, whereas in the continent, it's quite unlikely that invasive species drive to extinction to native species, but they may act in combination with other drivers such as land use change, climate change, pollution, or overexploitation. The costs associated with invasive species are also really high and increasing, and they are measured in the hundreds of billions of euros of dollars each year, even though this is just the tip of the iceberg, because the costs of invasive species are mostly borne by public administrations, and it's really difficult to keep track of all the person hours invested into managing them and all the resources invested into managing them. We also know that invasive species tend to be introduced for the first time and to thrive in altered human-transformed habitats, just because by definition they are related with human activities, they are introduced with human activities. So altered habitats have a higher trophic pressure, they have a lower resistance to invasive species, and invasive species have biological traits that are generalist, they tolerate a broad range of conditions that allow them to survive them. They often survive under pollution conditions that are completely unsuitable for native species at all. In a study, we found that the human footprint was a very consistent predictor of the global distribution of invasive species for all taxonomic groups, explaining about a quarter, more or less, of their global distribution. What's more, the suitability for invasive species tend to increase linearly with the human influence index up to a saturation point. And at around the human influence level between 20 and 25, more or less cross the threshold of 0.5% suitability, meaning that just by chance they are more likely to successfully establish rather than to fail. And what does a human influence index level of 25, because this is a unitless variable, it's difficult to tell, but if we have a look at a map of all values higher than 25, we see that this more or less identifies all the heavily industrialized and transformed regions of the world, which is precisely, I'm doing something wrong. Yep. Precisely where invasive species tend to accumulate, like this region in Northwestern Europe is usually a well-known hotspot of invasive species because there are mild environmental conditions and also because of the long history of travel, commerce, colonialism of all the countries around the British Channel. So more or less, the general patterns of invasion coincide with the general patterns of human transformation of the land. We also know that such altered habitats provide fewer biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's not that they provide none, like agroecosystems are quite important for biodiversity, but for instance, the provision of ecosystem services tend to be concentrated in provisioning services, whereas other biodiversity-related services, like regulating services, they do exist, but are quite diminished. Whereas in natural ecosystem, we tend to find a more balanced representation of different services, including those that have no economic value. So I'm not sure if you are following my thread, but this is my main rationale. Biodiversity and ecosystem services are declining. Invasive species are behind this decline, along with other drivers. Invasive species thrive in human-transformed environments, and these environments provide fewer biodiversity and ecosystem services. It thus follows that in human-transformed, heavily altered habitats that provide fewer ecosystem services, that support fewer or a lower number of native species, we may expect a high propagative pressure and a high representation of invasive species, simply because this is where they tend to be introduced and thrive for the first time. Whereas in the case of more natural, pristine ecosystems, where we've got a lot more to lose, they tend to be less exposed to invasive species simply because they are better conserved, they've got a lower propagative pressure. And if this is true, then they may remain relatively safe fish, from invasive species, because invasive species, of course, they move. They've got this bad habit of not staying put. So even if they are introduced in the other type of habitat, over time, they will keep moving and they will keep reaching this type of habitats, which are the ones we should be focusing. So I'm going to show you 3 of my most important studies, I think. And the first one was a global review and meta-analysis of the impacts that invasive species have on aquatic ecosystems. So our main questions were, what are the impacts on the abundance, the richness, and the aquatic community composition? And are those impacts dependent on the trophic position of the invader? Why focusing on the trophic position of the invader? Because aquatic ecosystems are fascinating, they're really interesting. They mostly work as islands. They are isolated from the surrounding. Species have co-evolved for a long time in isolation, and they create a trophic web with very tight links. They are really linked to many other species in the web. So they are very vulnerable to any gain or loss of a species. And it's very different to introduce an invasive species on the bottom of the trophic web, where it will affect the basal resources to the whole of the trophic web, rather than on the top, where a top predator will feed on its prey, therefore releasing from competitors and predators to other species. So we'll have a cascading negative and positive impact along the food web. And we reviewed over 700 different cases of impacts on invaded ecosystems in comparison with control uninvaded systems. And we found a general decrease in the abundance of native communities for most of the taxonomic groups in aquatic communities, which makes sense. But we didn't find a similar decline in richness. We couldn't find a similar decline in the richness of different types of aquatic organisms. And we believe this can have 2 explanations, and actually they are non-exclusive. Both of them can work at the same time. First, this might reflect a certain extinction depth, in the sense that you may expect abundance to decline first, and over time, maybe they lead to extinctions. But not necessarily, because there are lots of microhabitats in aquatic ecosystems. So maybe aquatic communities are able to adapt and to respond to invasive species by modifying the habitat structure, the community structure, without necessarily losing the overall number of species. And actually, when you break down these impacts by the functional role of the invader and the different types of aquatic species that they can affect, we can see, we lost it, that there are both positive and negative impacts. So there are cascading impacts with different signs. We can see that plants mostly affect fish, which we believe is because of changes in habitat structure and the hiding places that fish have. Filter feeders, they deplete plankton in communities, but they provide habitat and resources to other invertebrates and to plants. Omnivores feed on invertebrates and some macrophytes, and they release from predators to other species. And fish deplete some of the species they prey upon, but again releasing from competitors and predators to other groups of species. So when we go to the details, we can see that it's not as simple as a plain decrease in richness and abundance, but it depends a lot on the functional role of the invader and the functional role of the prey. We also saw significant changes in ecosystems, like an increase in turbidity, an increase in nitrogen, a decrease in organic matter, and a decrease in phosphorus. But again, you can see that it's not as simple, and sometimes there is an increase, sometimes there is a decrease, but these changes in the basic functionality of the ecosystem that will have an impact on the ecosystem services provided by aquatic ecosystems. And this is something we quite often don't pay attention to. We often focus on native species and not on the functions and the ecosystem services of the invaded ecosystems. So in our second study, we focused on protected areas. First, we asked, are there invasive species in protected areas? Because we may have this naive vision of a high-altitude protected area, so pristine, so beautiful. It is difficult to think of invasive species as a threat, right, in these kind of ecosystems. But actually, we don't really know. We haven't looked into it. We also wonder how susceptible are native species protected by the Habitats Directive to these invasive species. And will climate change facilitate the expansion of invasive species from other first entry regions into protected areas? In this case, we focused our attention in a list of 100 of the worst invasive species. This is a list of species that is representative of the type of invasive species that we can find in Europe. Not everybody will agree in that these are the worst, but at least I think they are representative of the different type of invasive species, the type of life histories that we can find in Europe. We look at the Natura 2000 network. There is 15,000 polygons in the Natura 2000 network in Europe. And we could find 90,000 records of these 100 worst invasive species within the protected areas, which is quite a lot. But you can see they're not everywhere, right? They're concentrated here in Northwest Europe, same area that I showed you before in the hotspot map. And in fact, 3/4 of the Natura 2000 network of protected areas have not reported any of these 100 worst invasive species, which I believe it is good news. They might be there, they might be unreported, you know, maybe we don't know they are there, but with all the information we could find, 3/4 of the network are free from these 100 invaders. Then we looked at the native species that may be affected from them. So from the 100 worst invasive species, these were the top invaders affecting the highest number of native species in the Habitats Directive, the American mink, the brown rat, and the red swamp crayfish. We could identify almost 150 native species protected under the Habitats Directive that could be negatively affected by these invasive species. We had scientific evidence of a potential negative role. I'm sure these invasive species can affect way more species, but we don't have the certainty. Not all of these 150 native species are endangered. They've got various levels of, and you know, the classification was varied. We got lots of them are least concerned, but some of them are vulnerable, near threatened, or endangered. And again, we looked at where in the Natura 2000 network of protected areas are these native species being protected, being sheltered. And the result is quite different. They're present everywhere. The only exception is the United Kingdom. Don't know what happens there. There's not much to protect, apparently. But other than that, they're present everywhere. They're present in 99% of the protected areas in Europe. Makes sense. We are designing protected areas to protect them, so it could be weird otherwise. But if you cross this map with the one that I showed you before for invasive species, you can see that there is a clear mismatch. The latitudinal gradients for both types of species are uncorrelated. They only coincide in some places here, right? Mostly here, right? Also here in the Mediterranean. But these are the impact hotspots. That's how I call them. Impact hotspots, would be here, those places that combine a high exposure to invasive species with a high vulnerability of native communities. Another thing that we found interesting was that the date the protected area was designed was really important. All the protected areas designated before the 70s did not report almost any of these 100 worst invasive species. And it makes sense because invasive species became a thing from the 80s and 90s. So protected areas declared from these dates on, probably they already had invasive species within the limits of the protected area because it's not a criterion to not declare some place as a protected area. The most important criterion is to protect the native species. But we also found that native species were pretty well covered from the beginning. So this graph kind of tells us that protection actually works. You got a place that was not invaded, you protected, you got an active management, and you prevent invasive species from coming. So the sooner we declare protected areas, the better we will prepare to face the threat associated with invasive species. Of course, the situation may change in the future because, as I said, invasive species keep moving. They keep expanding their ranges. And all climatic models suggest they will go towards the north and the east of Europe at a velocity much higher than similar projections for native species. And actually, in a study that we're about to publish, it is not published yet, but it will in the next weeks, we had a look at the velocity of a spread of native and invasive species, and we found that, so this is across all different taxonomic groups, but we got the overall data here, the main data for all taxa, and the spread of range change for invasive species by their natural means is 100 times higher than for native species. But if we have a look at human-introduced spreads, like with the support of different human means, we are talking of spreads 1,000 times faster than for native species. So just because the biological traits and their association with human activities, invasive species are able to keep up with climate changes a lot better and a lot faster than native species, which means that even though our studies suggest that protected areas are kind of shielding native species from invasive species, it may become more and more difficult in the future. Okay, our third study goes one step further. Each study is a little bit more complicated than the one before, and looks into ecosystem services, the provision of ecosystem services. Because, as I said, I think most of the research has focused on impacts on native species and not so much on ecosystem services. And it makes sense because it's a lot more difficult to measure impacts on ecosystem services. So our questions in this case were, which are the ecosystem services most frequently affected by invasive species? Where are the impact hotspots, these areas that combine high exposure with high vulnerability? And do they differ across different ecosystem services? Do impact hotspots change? So we focused again on a subset of 100 species. These are the ones that are legally considered in Europe, in the Union list of invasive species. So they are not exactly the same as the ones that we investigated in the previous study, but around half of them are the same. There's a very high overlap. But it's just a subgroup of around 100 invasive species that are considered to be the worst in Europe and that are representative of the different types of invasive species that we can find here. And as you can see, we've got plants and animals, aquatics and terrestrials. And these are the different elements that we found evidence of impact. So all of them have impacts on biodiversity. This is normally the reason why they are considered invasive. And they do have lots of different impacts on, well, here I use nature contribution to people, which is a slightly different classification of ecosystem services. But you can see that those that are more heavily affected are human experiences. This includes human health, human recreation, sports, landscape alteration, anything that can affect our way of life, our good quality of life. And also habitat creation is also affected by a lot of different invasive species, and also the provision of food. Things like crop production, aquaculture, fishing are quite heavily affected by invasive species. Also the transmission of diseases, of detrimental organisms. They are usually vectors or hosts of many different diseases. And because they've got high abundances, it makes it even, riskier because there's a high prevalence. We obtained maps of the provision of ecosystem services in Europe. We didn't create these maps. We obtained them from the European Commission. So these maps here represent the provision of habitat maintenance, soil retention, and outdoor creation. And then we look at the occurrences of invasive species affecting each of these ecosystem services in Europe. We could see that the majority of them are present in low provisioning areas. So this goes in line with our initial hypothesis that invasive species are more prevalent in human-altered habitats that usually provide fewer ecosystem services. This is, again, good news. I mean, if they are present in low provisioning areas, that's better for us, than in other type of sites. But it was not the same for all ecosystem services. In the case of nitrogen retention, which is a measure of how good are aquatic ecosystems to process all the pollution that comes to them, and crop provision, invasive species likely to affect these two services were most frequently present in high provisioning areas. And this means that two very important economically strategic services are more under threat from invasive species. So we had these maps that I just showed you that represent the provision of ecosystem services classified into three categories: low, medium, and high provisioning. And we modeled the potential distribution of the invasive species. And again, we classify them into three classes, so low, medium, and high suitability for invasion. And by crossing these two maps, we end up with a matrix of 9 potential categories of risk or categories of threat. The most important ones are this corner over here. This represents sites with a high suitability for invasion, so a high exposure, but also with a high provision of ecosystem services. It means a high vulnerability. So as I've been telling you, these are the places that we believe are most important because they combine high exposure with high vulnerability. These are the impact hotspots we are more interested in. Another interesting corner here is areas that have a very low suitability for invasion and a very high provision of ecosystem services because they may be considered safer for the provision of ecosystem services. If we do this for every single combination of an invasive species and the ecosystem services that we know they can affect, then we end up with these maps that allow us to identify where are the hotspots located and where are the safe areas located. You can see this quite the difference between the northern part of Europe, all in purple colors, and the southern part in more bluish, greenish colors. This is the Himalayan balsam, by the way, and it was crossed with the map representing soil retention. And we can do the same for all the invasive species that we know can affect soil retention. So here we represent the coverage in Europe, the percentage of Europe that is classified in the 4 corners of this matrix. So you see that the blue colors know that there are some particular invasive species that have a higher coverage of hotspots, whereas other species have a higher coverage of safe places. Then if we crop out these hotspots here, for all of the invasive species, for these 20-something invasive species, we crop all the hotspots, and then we put them all together in a single map, a hotspot of hotspot map. We end up with something like this, where we can see where are the impact hotspots for soil retention located in Europe. And you can see they are mostly related in the Scandinavian peninsula and in some high altitude regions in Europe. And we can do the same with the rest of the services, like we got here, habitat maintenance, again highlighting the Scandinavian peninsula. We got outdoor recreation, because this is a service provided all over Europe. We end up with this scattered distribution of the hotspots. Then we got nitrogen retention, and because this is the most industrialized regions, the ones that demand more water purification, these are the ones that are considered impact hotspots too. And finally, crop provision with impact hotspots located in Northern Europe. This may come as a surprise, right? Because the Mediterranean is where we grow all the crops. How come it is not a hotspot? This is because this map do not represent crop production yields. It represents ecosystems' contribution to crop provision. And crops in Northern Europe are a lot more reliant on natural ecosystems than crop provision in Southern Europe, where it is heavily subsidized by irrigation, fertilizers, and herbicides. This is why crop productivity in Southern Europe is not so dependent on natural conditions and is not so vulnerable to invasive species. Then maybe because invasive species do affect irrigation channels too. So, but that's a different story. Of course, this situation can change in the future, because this is where we know these 100 species are present today. This map is based on real occurrences. You can see most of them are, again, located around the British Channel and some low valleys in France. But the distribution models suggest they may expand the range quite a lot. On average, across the 100 species, the average increase in range expansion is 77%, and this is under current environmental conditions. We're not even considering climate change. So I told you I was going to talk about models only, but I lied. Of course, I'm going to talk a little bit about field conditions. I'm going to show you a field study. I'm a field ecologist too. I do a lot of models, but I'm a field ecologist, and I still go to the field. Actually, I've been in the field the whole week, so I didn't have much time to prepare this talk. So if I run out of time, just let me know, but this is the end. So part of the research that I've been doing is looking at the impacts of aquatic invasive species on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And the example that I'm going to show you here today is about the apple snail. The apple snail is a snail the size of an apple. It's really big. It's really disgusting. You can see it here. It's like a sea monster. It comes from South America, and it was first introduced in Southeast Asia as a source of protein because they do like eating snails there. But it turns out it tastes very bad. And it also can transmit diseases to humans. So it was a big failure. There was no business there. And it turns out apple snails love eating rice plants. So rice production is really important in Southeast Asian countries. And these species decimated their use for years and years. It was a really bad situation. It is also sold in the aquarium trade. It is the typical cute snail that you buy to clean the walls of the aquarium. But when it goes to the field, it keeps growing and it becomes this monster. So it appeared in the Lower Ebro River in 2009, quite likely as an escape from a company there that was dedicated to selling products to aquarium for the pet trade. The Lower Ebro River is a fascinating place to work with because you've got any invasive species you can imagine. You've got invasive plants, fish, mollusks, invertebrates, algae, everything is there. I believe this is probably one of the biggest hotspots of aquatic invasive species in Europe, if not the world. So it's kind of really interesting for me because I've got a lot of things to choose from, right? But this was the big deal back in 2010, and this was our study species. From the moment it was detected in the river, a task force was created that goes there during the whole active season of the species from April to November and manually removes it from the river. Can you imagine how hard that is? They go during the day and they take out the eggs that are bright pink. They are really easy to spot because they are outside water. These are poisonous. They have no predators. They're so poisonous. And then the crew comes back at night to look for the adults because they hide during the day and they come out at night to feed. So it is easier to spot them there. And the adults are so big and their shell is so hard, no predators in the area can eat them either. That's why they're growing so much. They have no predators and no competitors either. There are no native snails in this area. The only species that over the years has finally learned how to feed from apple snails is the glossy ibis, el morito. I don't know if you know this bird, but it took it like 8 years to figure out how to, get to the apple snail, and the predatory pressure is really low, definitely not enough to control it. So the blue bars are the adult snails that were being retrieved weekly from the river, and the orange line is the eggs. And as you can see, it was not looking really good. Despite all the efforts they put into removing the snail, it kept increasing. And the numbers in 2007 indicated a really bad 2018 year. We see a decrease here, but this is just the seasonal trend of the species. In November, they disappear, they go into hibernation or whatever, and then they come back in April when the temperature is right. Surprisingly, they dropped by 90% in 2018. And the populations keep dropping then following years. There was some fluctuation here, but you see a quite different picture. What happened? Another invader, the blue crab. The blue crab arrived to the Ebro River, and we believe it is the reason why we saw this heavy decline in apple snail. Now, we've seen in the past invasive species that facilitate the establishment of other invasive species. The zebra mussel is a really good example. It facilitates other invaders from the same Ponto-Caspian region to establish because it provides resources and habitat for them. But the interesting thing here is that the blue crab comes from America too, but from a different part of America. The blue crab and the apple snail have never coincided before, not in their native or their invaded range, as far as we know. And yet, really rapidly, the blue crab figured out how to feed from this apple snail and benefited from the ample food sources provided by it. So apple snail basically fueled the expansion of the blue crab. The blue crab is a marine species. We can find it here 50 kilometers from the sea. It has to go back to the sea to reproduce, but the males keep going up waters. Why? Because it has a lot to eat. So we had a look at the characteristics of the aquatic communities in places that are not yet invaded by any of the species, control sites, places invaded by the blue crab, and places invaded by both the apple snail and the blue crab, because there's nowhere the apple snail could hide. Everywhere the apple snail was, the blue crab was too. And we saw that there are no significant differences in taxonomic richness or taxonomic diversity, but there are significant differences in functional richness and functional diversity. This means that even though it may appear that there are not much impacts, the number of species remains more or less the same, there's been a change in community structure. And now the aquatic communities in invaded places are functionally more homogeneous among them. They are all the same. And this is not only happening in the different invaded places in the Ebro, but in all places in the world invaded by exactly the same invasive species. We've got exactly the same communities dominated by just a few invaders, the zebra mussel, the apple snail, the blue crab, in many different places of the world. And this is kind of scary because we don't know what are the consequences in the long term of having lots of places around the world with exactly the same species composition. The last thing that we did there, this is my last part, I promise, was some experiments. We built these enclosures to be able to separate individuals of blue crabs and apple snails and have a look at their per capita impacts on local communities. So these allow us to separate them and then to control how we feed them. we put them in the side of the river, so it was like an in situ experiment. In the first place, we fed the apple snail with one local macrophyte, the feathers, parrot's feather, I believe it is called in English. In Spanish, it is cola de zorro. So that was the local macrophyte, and also with rice plants that they seem to love. And we use the relative impact potential, which is a standardized measure of the per capita impact of invasive species. And basically what we can see is that it can feed really rapidly on both species, probably more with the rice plant. But what's more important, at the end of the experiment, it has gained a lot more weight when fed with rice plants than when fed with the local macrophytes. And this means the rice plant is more nutritious, it's more palatable for the apple snail rather than the native macrophytes, so no wonder they prefer eating it. In the case of the blue crab, we fed it with two invasive species, with apple snails. We had to take the opportunity to see what was going on there. And with the Asian clam. They used to be quite abundant in the area, and I say used to be because we could only find empty shells around the area where the blue crab was. And we believe that's because it depleted that source of food. We had to go upwaters to find material for the experiments. The blue crab was able to feed on surprisingly large quantity of both species, Asian clams and apple snails. It almost ate like its own weight in prey every single day. It was kind of surprising, but it clearly preferred the apple snail. And at the end of the experiment, it has gained a lot more weight when fed with apple snails than when fed with Asian clam. And it makes sense because the apple snail is way bigger. So, you know, it gets a lot more protein, a lot more nutrients when feeding on apple snails than when feeding on Asian clams that are really tiny, almost like eating sunflower seeds. So we believe that the presence of these invasive species in the lower Ebro River has fueled the population abundance of the blue crab. The problem is, when it runs out of Asian clams and it runs out of apple snails, of other invasive species, it will keep eating. This is a killing machine. So it will eat in other things. And this is a process known as hyperpredation, where one species facilitates the growth of another, and then this will increase the predatory pressure on other collateral native species. And it's kind of important for the conservation of other filter feeders in the area. Our results coincide with those of Miguel Clavero in Doña Lava local station that look at the impacts of the blue crab on the green crab. You can see here quite the drop in green crab and the increase in blue crab, and also other species of fish in the coastal areas around the Ebro Delta. And the results were quite similar. They were reporting a massive decline in native biodiversity after the arrival of the blue crab. So the conclusions from these three studies are that invasive species got major declines in the abundance and eventually the diversity of native communities, but it's probably important to have a look at the functional diversity, changes in functional diversity rather than taxonomy diversity, because it will give us a lot more information. Protected areas are relatively safe. They are working against invasive species because of their low accessibility and active management. But things can change. We can now lower our guard. They may be under threat in the future, considering how fast invasive species can move. And ecosystem services are pervasively affected by invasive species, particularly those that are co-produced with human activities, such as the provision of food, materials, or energy, and the purification of water. But the areas that are on the greatest risk are really limited. The hotspot that I showed you before cover a really tiny proportion of Europe. So if we focus on those first, because those are the areas where we have a lot more to lose, we will use our resources a lot more efficiently. So sometimes when we face a problem like climate change or invasive species, it can seem like too big, right? Like there's nothing we can do. Invasive species, they are collateral from globalization, and we are not going to stop globalization, so why bother, right? Many invasive species are present in ecosystems so damaged then non-native species can longer live there. So why not letting them come over and take their place? But actually, when we break down problems, they become a lot more manageable, a lot more feasible to address. And I believe, or I try to do precisely that. We take a big problem, invasive species. The IPBES report said that there are around 37,000 non-native species reported globally. But we break it down. It's not all invasive species we're worried about, right? We can start with those that have a legal status, that we already have evidence about the negative impacts, and they are included in national or international listings. And for species that are not yet here, we can have a look at their invasion history and use horizon scanning to identify which species specifically can become a threat. And suddenly the 30,000 non-native species becomes only a couple of hundreds. And a couple of hundreds invasive species are a lot more manageable than 37,000. We can also prioritize sites. We are not interested in removing invasive species anywhere. That's not possible. We haven't got the resources for that. But let's focus on the points of entry. The ports, the airports, the high populated areas where invasive species tend to be identified for the first time. We know where they are. This is not a big secret. Let's set up alert systems. Let's be prepared to face them the moment we get here until it is too late. We can also prioritize protected areas because there is where we got more to lose. More native species under threat, more ecosystem services under threat. There are not that many protected areas where we got this combination of invasive species and native species that may specifically impact. So let's focus on those impact hotspots. And finally, let's prioritize ecosystem services. Let's prioritize those that have an economic value because they are important for us and they seem to be more heavily threatened. Or let's focus on impact hotspots because they are really limited in space and we will make a better use of our limited resources. By breaking down a big problem into smaller problems, I think things can move forward to meet all these global biodiversity conservation targets. My colleagues in the IUCN repeat this quite frequently. Invasive species is not a lot cost. It's only a few hundred of invasive species that are really problematic. And if we focus on them and if we join efforts, we can make progress. We may not solve it completely, but we can definitely change things for the better. So that was my last take-home message. I'd like to thank, well, the research that I showed you today here has been done mostly at the University of Cambridge, la Estación Biológica de Doñana y el Instituto Pirenaico de Ecología, which is where I'm working now. And in all of these studies, I've come with the collaboration of Moser Avila, that was my supervisor when I came back to Spain at Doñana Biological Station, and we've worked together ever since, and this is the person that I have learned most from, so I'm really grateful to her. And finally, my group, my research group, el Grupo de Restauración Ecológica in Zaragoza, we are always looking for potential master students, PhD students, postdoc students. So if anybody is interested in invasive species or other research related with providing solutions to conservation problems like ecological restoration and so on, please let me know and we can see what the potential is. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Preguntas en español o en inglés, como queráis.
Lo que prefiráis.
Son bienvenidas para Belinda, sí. Paso el micrófono.
Hi, Belinda. I'm Luis Pertierra, here from the museum.
¿Cómo? Perdón.
Luis Pertierra.
Luis, vale.
Just working on invasive species in the poles.
In the poles?
Yeah, in Antarctica and the Arctic. Just a couple of questions. I don't know which one first, maybe the philosophical one. So I was interested that there was given more value, more importance to the material and the regulating services, but the ones that rank lower were the non-material one, And then this is where I philosophically argue against that, in that maybe it's a matter of perception by the society or something, but I will say there's a lot of non-material services that have been impacted by invasive species and could rank higher. I'm thinking of aesthetics, I'm thinking of science, right? Preserving pristine ecosystems just to study them. There's the bioprospecting and obviously the recreational service. So I'm just curious why they got sidelined, I guess.
Yeah, all of those that you mentioned now, they are included within the human experience category. And yeah, it is one of the most heavily affected ones. Like the others, maintenance of options, identities, learning and inspiration, these are kind of tricky to really find the evidence for them. I'm sure there is a lot more impacts there, but sometimes they are not phrased as such. So yeah, I think these are underrated quite a lot. But I totally agree with you. This is heavily biased by the evidence available and how it is phrased. It's not that there are no more impacts in other nature's contributions to people. It's just that we couldn't really find it. But yeah, I totally agree with you.
All right. The other question is about context dependencies, about, right, this is all of Europe, right? And the north of Europe is very different to the south of Europe because the biotic and abiotic filters change a little bit. And my result seems that alien species in the poles don't care that much about human disturbances, right? And rather copycat, the strategies of the natives. So my question here was, for all these studies that were based on the richness of species, I wonder if it would be a step up to do the phylodiversity of species, in that it's not necessarily the same two species of the same genus, that two species of completely different groups. And in this case, it may be that in Southern Europe, right, the phylodiversity is higher, so the functional diversity of aliens is higher, so the impact could be even worse than so I was wondering if phylogenetic corrections could alter some of these interpretations.
Definitely, yeah, totally agree. Yeah, anything that has to do with phylogenetic relationships, with functionality, I think we still need to go that way. I believe that we are stuck in really simple studies that my studies are just taking into account present absence and not even considering abundance. But just because that information is difficult to find at this scale, I can find it at the local scale. That's why I do local studies too. But it's really difficult to scale it up. But definitely, I mean, what you said, the distance, the phylogenetic distance between the invader and the local communities, definitely important. It's one of the most important things. And I think it is a really interesting thing to study. Yeah, our studies are flawed. They're just a first step, they show you trends, but it's nothing definite. We cannot really say an invasive species is going to appear here. We can only see the trend is increasing, they're going towards the northeast of Europe, but we cannot be more specific with this level of detail. I agree.
More questions?
Don't be shy.
Hi, Belinda. Invasive species also carry microbes. So what is known about the impact of those microbes that are also invasive species?
You mean microbes that are also invasive? Yeah. We've done some research on zoonotic diseases, like overall for animals, because they are well-known vectors and reservoirs for different types of diseases. And there's not much on that, I have to say. I think it is a really fascinating new field of research, because going into this mix of ecology and environmental and human health, that's the way to go. It's definitely important. We've done some research using models similar to the ones that I showed you for invasive mammals that are known to be reservoirs of different parasites and pathogens they can be zoonotic and affect humans. And we cross them with the incidence of the diseases those pathogens provide. And we did something similar. We created impact hotspots, but in this case, we were mixing the invasive species with human populations to identify the contact areas and things like that. And I think it is so interesting. But when you look at the literature, there's not much to extract there. And also, you got all the prevalence of the pathogens, and you got the incidence of the diseases they cause, but it's just circumstantial evidence, right? You cannot really link the invasive species with the diseases unless it is really a novel disease that cannot transmit any other pathogen in Europe. That happens with the raccoon. It brought some new pathogens that were not here before, so we can really link them to these new diseases. But for others, it's really difficult to tell. And there are contrasting hypotheses about the role of invasive species, because sometimes they can amplify pathogens and microbes because they got this really high density, so they got a high prevalence. But in other cases, they can have a diluting effect. If they are not as good as reservoirs for a particular microorganism, they may provide some kind of dilution effect. So yeah, but not many studies have looked into this, and I think it's really interesting. So many things too.
Okay, thank you.
How's your name, by the way?
Mireia Mestre.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I thought you were. Okay, we can talk later.
Hi, Belinda. Thanks for the nice talk. I'm Joaquín Hortal. So
Joaquín, hola.
Yeah, hola. So I'm the Troy McClure of biases, but I'm not going to ask you about biases because I really want to thank you about the bones track, which is, I find it quite interesting. May I ask, where did you measure the trait variation? Is the impact on macrophytes?
Invertebrates.
Invertebrates.
We looked at the biological traits of invertebrates, yeah.
Okay. And did you look at within species and between species variation? Because
no, it was at the general level, not
okay.
within species, yeah.
Okay, because it's something that we have, when you measure individuals, we have found in working at the Azores and other places, that depending on the kind of impact of the invasive species, within species, I mean, sometimes they are like collecting or affecting a particular part of the populations of certain ones, so they are selecting within species the largest.
Like a filter.
Yeah, they filter,
Yeah.
but they filter within the species.
Yeah,
rather than,
okay. They filter particular individuals with particular traits.
Yeah, exactly. They will, for example, target the biggest ones only,
okay.
but the small ones still can thrive.
Oh,
So
that's so interesting.
yeah.
Things become more and more complex, right? Like
Yeah,
you add
yeah,
a layer of complexity and you can always add
Yeah.
another. It's amazing.
Yeah. And have you measured, just that's more general, because you showed the richness. Have you measured the overlap of the functional spaces, the trait variation
The
spaces?
functional diversity.
Yeah, the
raw
overlap
diversity.
between, yeah,
I think it
because
is.
you had richness, but
richness.
just to see if there is a shift in the trait space.
A shift in yeah, we did multivariate analysis with all the traits. So basically, we didn't measure traits at the individual level, but we used these tables, these fuzzy tables that give you scores of how likely they are to have particular traits. Yeah. And so we use fuzzy statistics like 84. I don't know if you are familiar with this things. Yeah. So yeah. I didn't include it here, but we did multivariate analysis too, where we got the trait space. Okay. And we can see that the invaded places are separated from the non-invaded.
There is a shift in the
there is a shift. It's complicated because for each individual trait, the story is quite different.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, and it's not so intuitive. Like you see, okay, in invaded places there are more volcanism and this type of respiration, but those are traits that are difficult to link with. Yeah. Like feeding strategy is way easier. Like you see, well, the prey have disappeared in invaded places. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. But if species moving in a particular way or breeding in a particular way are the ones that have disappeared, you don't know how to explain that. They're kind of tricky. But we have seen a change in the functional composition of communities after invasion. We just don't know exactly what are the mechanisms behind or how to explain it, because it's not so obvious. Yeah.
Okay.
But
yeah.
again, a really interesting way
Yeah.
to continue researching,
No,
because we don't know much about that.
It looks like a fascinating system
Yeah.
to check that.
And at the end,
Yeah.
those functions are the ones that affect ecosystem functionality and therefore affect ecosystem services, you know.
Yeah.
So it is all linked. We need to understand the mechanism affecting community functionality in order to understand what happened to the overall ecosystem services. Otherwise, we don't really know what's going on. So it's a missing link. But it takes a lot of effort.
Yes, and if I may, I have another final question.
No.
Okay, yeah. No, it's because of time we are getting. So just, and this is something I've been curious since I saw your papers years ago, those Europe, I mean, and the global papers about how much of this less impact on protected areas is because of you actually mentioned that they may be controlled, but they may be present, or simply because the people going there is not recording the invasive species. And that works both ways. For the protected areas, so it's an unrecording of the invaders, and also for the difference between the north and the south. So there is a difference, I mean, of sampling effort. Do you think there is any effect of that, or?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we don't know really. We don't know how unreported invasive species are from protected areas. But we are doing a lot more research now. We've got an international network of researchers looking into invasive species in protected areas specifically. So a lot more information is resurfacing. And we are all surprised to see how many invasive species are in protected areas. We didn't expect that much. Yeah, there's quite a lot.
But in small populations, at least. So is there a positive side? I mean, they are there, but they are not monopolizing the system.
Yeah, they haven't dominated the systems. Yeah, we don't know much about the dominance. We know they're present. Yeah, but this is something going on. But yeah, the IUCN and other organisms, they are clearly, I mean, their goal is to mitigate the impact of invasive species in protected areas. So I think we're going to move there. But when I've spoken to representative of protected areas, there is a lot of denialism. They're kind of, oh no, that's not a problem here. We haven't got of those. Yes, you do. Maybe they're not as important as climate change or pollution or other threats in your park, but they are there. Yeah. And you should have a plan in place, a strategic plan on how to deal with them. You cannot just do, because the managers are kind of, yeah, but you know, we'll have them under control. We do this here, we do this there, but there's not a strategic plan. And the different parks, they don't share their experiences. So in each park, they are managing invasive species. They try and fail, you know, they try different options. They realize this is not working, they try another, but they don't share that information with the other park. So we're losing time there. We need a strategic plan. But definitely, yeah, there's a lot more than we reported in our study, definitely.
Thanks, Belinda.
Thank you very much. I think it was the last question. So
Well, lots of interesting questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
It was a very interesting
I hope it was not too
talk.
boring.
Thank you.